The ferry's engine groaned, a relentless thrum that vibrated through Dean's bones, a dull counterpoint to the hollow ache beneath his ribs. He stood on the damp deck, the salt spray a cold kiss against his face, tasting of rust and deep ocean. The mainland, a smudge of gray, receded into the churning haze behind them. It was a place he'd only ever seen on his grandfather's faded charts, a jagged scar on the otherwise smooth expanse of the sea. Solitude. That was the siren song that had drawn him here, to this remote, fog-shrouded outpost. He was a cartographer by trade, someone who sought order in lines and contours, but his own life had become a blurred, illegible map. This inheritance, this desolate lighthouse keeper's cottage, was his last desperate attempt to redraw the boundaries of his existence. The ferry bumped against the barnacle-encrusted dock, a sound like grinding teeth. A single weathered figure, the dockmaster, waited, his silhouette a stark cutout against the perpetual gloom. Dean retrieved his bags, the canvas heavy in his grip, each one a testament to the life he'd packed away. The dockmaster offered a curt nod, his gaze lingering a moment too long, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he turned to secure the ferry lines. The path to the cottage was little more than a sheep track, winding upwards through gnarled, wind-stunted vegetation that clawed at the air like skeletal fingers. Above him, the lighthouse stood sentinel, its glass eye opaque in the thick fog, a silent, unblinking witness to the island's secrets. The cottage itself clung to the clifftop like a limpet, a stoic defiance against the relentless elements. Its whitewash was peeling, the window frames warped, and the front door, a heavy oak slab, sagged on its hinges. It smelled of brine and long-abandoned dreams, a deep, pervasive dampness that seemed to permeate the very stones. He pushed the door open, the groan of protesting wood echoing through the empty rooms. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating a scene of quiet decay. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets stood like ghosts, their forms indistinct and unsettling. He spent the first hour simply walking through the cottage, his footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. Each room offered a different flavor of neglect. The kitchen held a faint, lingering scent of stale pipe tobacco and something metallic, like old pennies. Later, as the light began to fade, Dean ventured outside, driven by an instinct to survey his new domain. The fog had intensified, swallowing the distant horizon, muting the roar of the waves into a muffled, rhythmic pulse. He walked the perimeter of the cottage, tracing the line of a crumbling stone wall. The ground was uneven, treacherous with loose shale and clumps of tough, wiry grass. It was then he saw it, partially obscured by a dense thicket of thorny gorse bushes, a low, concrete structure, almost entirely swallowed by the encroaching earth. It was a crude, brutalist design, utterly out of place amidst the natural ruggedness of the island. A single heavy steel hatch, rusted and paint-blistered, lay flat on the ground, secured by a series of massive corroded bolts. This wasn't a shed or a root cellar. This was something else entirely. A shiver, unrelated to the biting wind, traced its way down Dean's spine. He knelt, brushing away handfuls of damp soil and matted leaves. He tried to budge it, grunting with effort, but it was sealed tight, as if welded to the ground. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the metal, a subtle vibration that he felt more than heard, like a distant, deep-seated hum. It was a sound that seemed to come from below, from the very bedrock of the island. For a moment, there was nothing but the dull echo of his own blood in his ears. Then, a distinct impression, not quite a sound, but a feeling of vast emptiness, a profound, crushing pressure. And beneath that, a faint, rhythmic thump, like something immense shifting in its sleep, deep within the earth. Dean scrambled back, his heart now a frantic drum against his ribs. The fog seemed to press in closer, blurring the edges of the already indistinct landscape. He stared at the hatch, his breath clouding in the cold air. The structure was an anomaly, a wound on the island's face. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this underground bunker was not simply a storage space. The island, he realized, was not offering him solitude. The ferry finally docked with a shudder that Dean felt deep in his gut, a resonant tremor that echoed the island's stark silence. He stepped onto the creaking planks of the pier, the air thick with brine and the scent of damp earth. The mainland, now completely swallowed by the churning gray, felt impossibly distant. Above him, the lighthouse stood sentinel, its glass eye still dark, waiting. His grandfather's cottage was a squat stone structure, hunkered against the relentless wind like a stoic beast. Dean moved through the small rooms, his boots echoing on the bare floorboards, a lonely sound in the sudden quiet. He ran a hand over a dusty bookshelf, a collection of forgotten nautical charts and weather-beaten almanacs. Here, he thought, he could finally find the quiet he desperately craved. A blank canvas for his own grief. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and attempting to impose some order on the cottage's accumulated disarray. He cleared cobwebs, aired out musty blankets, and mapped out the small, windswept property in his mind. But even as he worked, the island began to assert itself. The tide, he noticed, was peculiar. It didn't follow the predictable rhythm he knew from his coastal studies. Other times, it would surge with an unexpected ferocity, the waves crashing higher than seemed possible, sending spray arcing over the cottage roof. He'd stand at the window, watching the water's erratic pulse, a knot tightening in his stomach. Deliberate. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, a mournful lament whistling through the gaps in the old stone walls. But they were too persistent, too distinct. They seemed to rise and fall with the ocean's breath, sometimes a low, resonant hum, like a distant ship's horn. Other times a delicate, almost melodic murmur. It wasn't language, not exactly, but the cadence suggested it, a fragmented chorus that brushed against the edges of his hearing, just beyond comprehension. He'd pause, straining his ears, but the moment he focused, it would dissolve back into the wind's mournful sigh. He told himself it was the isolation, the vast emptiness of the island playing tricks on his tired mind. One blustery afternoon, while attempting to clear out a particularly damp corner of the cottage's tiny cellar, Dean discovered a heavy, rusted iron door half hidden behind a stack of rotting fishing nets. The hinge groaned in protest as he forced it open, revealing a narrow, stone-lined passageway that sloped downwards. The underground bunker was small, circular, its stone walls slick with condensation. In the center, on a crudely fashioned wooden table, sat a single leather-bound journal. It was swollen with damp, its cover warped, the pages within fused together in places by the relentless moisture. He carried it back to the relative warmth of the cottage, placing it carefully on the kitchen table. With a utility knife, he painstakingly separated the brittle pages. Many were blank, or so water-damaged as to be illegible. But others, preserved by some quirk of the damp, offered glimpses into his grandfather's fading sanity. The handwriting, usually precise, grew increasingly erratic, scrawling across the page like frantic seaweed. And then there were the sketches. Distorted figures, not quite human, with elongated limbs and eyes like polished obsidian, seemed to writhe amidst tangled kelp. There were maps, not of the island's surface, but of impossible depths, crisscrossed with lines that formed no recognizable constellations, only intricate looping patterns. He traced the words with a fingertip, a shiver snaking down his spine. The deep song. What did it mean? Was it a metaphor for the ocean's crushing power or something more literal? His grandfather, he knew, had been an eccentric, prone to long bouts of solitary contemplation. Perhaps this was merely the ramblings of a lonely man, isolated by the sea and time. Dean tried to convince himself. He was a cartographer, a man of facts, of surveyed lines and measurable depths. These were superstitions, nautical folklore, the product of a mind unmoored. He looked out the window. The tide was unusually high, the waves smashing against the rocks with a hunger he hadn't witnessed before. Reaching for the shore as if an invisible hand was pulling them. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he thought he heard a new note in the wind's song, a distinct, guttural syllable. The rationalizations felt thin, brittle, like the journal itself, threatening to crumble. The ferry's distant horn, a mournful bellow, had long since faded into the island's oppressive quiet. Dean stood on the small, warped porch of the cottage, the chill air seeping into his bones. The vast expanse of the ocean, a bruised purple under the perpetual overcast sky, stretched out before him, an indifferent, colossal presence. He felt small, insignificant, yet a strange pull, a sense of belonging tugged at him. This remote rock, this isolated dwelling was his now. He had sought solitude, and here, it was absolute. Inside, the cottage air hung heavy with the scent of salt, damp stone, and something else. Something metallic and faint, like old blood, or perhaps just the decay of time. He unpacked methodically, his movements a practiced ritual of control against the tide of his grief. The simple act of arranging books on a dusty shelf, of laying out fresh linens, grounded him. But even as he worked, his gaze kept straying to the worn leather-bound journal he'd found tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the living room, a discovery that had sparked a flicker of curiosity stronger than his exhaustion. He sat by the single window overlooking the churning gray waves, the journal heavy in his hands. His grandfather's script, once indecipherable scrawls, seemed to gain clarity with each passing hour on the island. The earlier entries spoke of solitude, of the ceaseless vigilance required of a lighthouse keeper. Then came the shift, subtle at first, then stark. References to the hum, the pull from below, and the waking. Dean traced a faded diagram, a crude star-like symbol encircled by wavy lines. What pact? With whom? Or what? He needed more. The cottage, despite its small size, felt like a repository of unspoken histories. He started his search systematically, beginning with the few shelves of water-damaged books. Its cover, faded to an unreadable gray, felt strangely dense, its pages brittle. Dean's brow furrowed. His grandfather, a rational man by all accounts, had kept this? The pages hinted at offerings, at a balance maintained, and then, ominously, at a balance broken. He spent the rest of the day immersed, moving from the journal to the old folklore book, then to his grandfather's meticulously organized, albeit cryptic, notes. The notes often referred to a subterranean vault, or the chamber below. Dean remembered exploring the small, sloping yard around the cottage earlier, noting a peculiar, almost unnatural rise in the earth behind the main structure, partially overgrown with hardy, wind-stunted bushes. He'd dismissed it then as a collapsed shed or a natural formation. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a growing sense of morbid determination, Dean pushed through the tangled undergrowth. He found it, not a shed, but a stout, rusted metal hatch, almost completely swallowed by the earth and clinging ivy. A wave of musty, damp air, thick with the scent of stagnant water and old earth, rushed out to greet him. This was no mere storage space. This was an underground bunker. He descended carefully, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing rough-hewn stone walls, slick with condensation. He found his grandfather's true sanctuary here. More journals, meticulously cataloged, filling an entire shelf. There were also strange, intricate carvings on the walls of one chamber, symbols that mirrored the one in the first journal, but more elaborate, almost alive in their complexity. He also discovered an old, tarnished brass compass, its needle spinning wildly, refusing to settle. It pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, with a soft internal light. His grandfather wasn't just observing. He was actively investigating, perhaps even attempting to understand or counteract the pact. The weight of his grandfather's obsession settled upon him. He heard voices, not human, but a chorus of guttural clicks and mournful wails that seemed to echo from the very core of the earth. His grandfather was speaking, but the words were lost in the roar of unseen currents, only the frantic movement of his lips conveying a desperate warning. Dean thrashed, entangled in the bedsheets, the dream's icy grip tightening. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of salt on his tongue. The cottage was silent, save for the rhythmic moan of the foghorn, now a mournful, solitary sound. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the cold floorboards. It emanated from the corner of the room, near the baseboard, where the old wallpaper met the wooden trim. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. There, clinging to the damp plaster, was a cluster of iridescent growth. It pulsed with a soft, ethereal blue-green light, like miniature submerged stars. Bioluminescent algae. It wasn't just a patch, it was spreading, a creeping, living thing, an alien beauty blooming in the heart of his inherited solitude. He hadn't seen it yesterday. It was here, in the cottage, a tangible, glowing testament to the unsettling truth of the island. The vast expanse of the ocean, a bruised purple under the perpetual overcast sky, stretched out before him, an immeasurable weight. He told himself it was just the isolation, the sheer emptiness of the place that made his skin prickle. He was a cartographer, a man of precise lines and measurable distances. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as the wind, or the ancient structure groaning against the relentless coastal elements. A framed nautical chart, tacked to the wall, seemed subtly askew. He swore he'd straightened it just yesterday. He reached out, his fingers brushing the yellowed parchment, and as he did, a heavy brass compass sitting on the small, scarred writing desk toppled over with a dull clang. There had been no breeze, no tremor. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on his work, spreading out his own blank charts, the precise tools of his trade laid out neatly. He found himself glancing up, expecting something. The air in the cottage felt thick, saline, as if the ocean itself had seeped through the walls. He went to the small, grimy mirror in the bathroom, intending to splash cold water on his face to shake off the creeping unease. His reflection stared back, his eyes wide, pupils dilated. For a fraction of a second, the contours of his face seemed to ripple, to pull inward, as if viewed through turbulent water. The skin stretched, the jawline blurred, and his eyes were not his own, but deep, fathomless pools reflecting an ancient, unblinking awareness. Then, as quickly as it came, the distortion vanished, leaving only his own pale, startled face. This wasn't just isolation. This wasn't just grief playing tricks. This was something else. He remembered his grandfather's cryptic notes, the odd sketches in the margins of his journals. Not maps, but strange, recursive patterns, symbols he'd never seen in any nautical lexicon. With an arrow pointing downward, accompanied by the word descent. He remembered a small, heavy iron ring set into the flagstone floor near the back of the cottage. He'd dismissed it as an old root cellar access. He moved the nets, pulled back the rug. He pulled, grunting with effort, and a section of the flagstone floor grated open, revealing a narrow, stone-lined passage leading down into absolute blackness. A gust of damp, earthy air, thick with the scent of brine and something faintly metallic, rose to meet him. This was it. The underground bunker. He grabbed a heavy lantern, its beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. The hum, which had been a low thrum in the cottage, intensified here. A visceral resonance that vibrated in his teeth. The walls of the underground bunker were slick with condensation, the raw rock weeping. It was a single claustrophobic chamber, perhaps 10 by 10 feet, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck. His lantern beam swept across the space, revealing shelves carved into the rock, holding an array of strange objects. Not tools, not provisions. There were small, carved wooden effigies, smoothed by countless touches, some wrapped in dried seaweed. Bowls of petrified, unidentifiable organic matter sat beside them, crusted with salt. On a small, flat stone slab in the center, which looked disturbingly like an altar, a collection of objects were arranged. A tarnished silver locket, a child's smooth white tooth. It smelled like decay and something sharp, almost like ozone. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to ward off something. This was an offering, a pact. Dean felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, horrifying understanding of the true nature of his inheritance. The hum in the underground bunker reached a crescendo, a deep, guttural vibration that filled his skull, pressing against his eardrums. The air grew impossibly heavy, suffocating. He could feel a pressure building, not just in his ears, but against his very skin, as if he were submerged. Dean stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell, his lantern clattering to the floor, its beam pointing erratically. It flowed, a silent, viscous wave, surging towards him with impossible speed. A choked cry tore from his throat. He scrambled backward desperately, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the damp stone. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged, blindly grabbing the lantern and scrambling up the steps, not even daring to look back. The iron door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang, echoing the frantic beat of his heart. It was real. It was here. And his grandfather had known. He had been feeding it. The heavy iron ring, cold and unforgiving beneath his fingers, yielded with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the very bedrock of the island. He pulled, muscles straining, and the flagstone, thick with age and damp earth, rose with a sucking sound. This wasn't a root cellar. This was something else entirely. He found a hurricane lamp in a dusty cupboard, its glass chimney clouded with soot, and lit it. With a deep breath, Dean descended. He felt it in his teeth, a dull ache that spread through his jaw. He reached the bottom, his boot landing on a floor of packed earth. The lamp's beam cut through the gloom, revealing a cramped, circular space, an underground bunker. The walls were rough-cut stone, sweating with condensation, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and ancient paper. Shelves lined one section, crammed with more journals, sea charts marked with indecipherable symbols, and strange, calcified objects that looked like petrified marine growths. Dean's gaze landed on a stack of leather-bound books, identical to the one he'd found in the cottage. His grandfather's handwriting, familiar yet now imbued with a new, unsettling urgency, filled the pages. The entries grew increasingly frantic. His grandfather hadn't merely been observing. He had been maintaining a pact, a ritual. Dean's eyes scanned the words, his mind struggling to process the implications. The deep song must be answered, one entry read, or it will call to something far worse. Another spoke of offerings and the turning of the tide, not of the sea. He read about the veil, a fragile barrier his grandfather had worked to uphold, a ward against the entity. His grandfather hadn't been a reclusive old man, but a sentinel, a guardian. And now, Dean realized with a sickening lurch, that duty had fallen to him. The deep song intensified, a relentless bass note vibrating in his chest. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions persisted. They were those figures etched into the stone, or merely the play of light? He couldn't be sure. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but a chorus of them, indistinct and watery, speaking in a language that felt ancient and alien. He clutched the journal tighter, his knuckles white. He could taste salt on his tongue, not from the air, but from somewhere deeper, an internal wellspring. One tunnel led from the bunker, deeper still, marked with a symbol he now recognized from the journal, a spiraling vortex surrounded by eyes. Beneath it, his grandfather had scrawled, "The Heart." where the veil is thinnest. He saw flashes, fleeting images of colossal, undulating forms in the periphery of his vision, just beyond the lamp's reach. The journal described a chamber beneath the lighthouse, a place of convergence where the entity's influence was most potent. His grandfather had performed the ritual there year after year to keep the ancient thing dormant. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Dean, a crushing burden. He wasn't just on an island, he was on a prison, and the jailer was gone. He traced the diagram again, his finger lingering on the spiral mark. The bunker was merely an antechamber, a preparation. The true work, the true horror, lay deeper. The lamp flickered, its light struggling against the encroaching gloom. He was moving towards the lighthouse, not from above, but from below, drawn by a terrible, undeniable summons. It vibrated in Dean's teeth, rattled the bones in his skull, and made the very air around him feel thick, like liquid. He stumbled, his legs refusing to obey. The ground beneath him no longer stable, but a shifting, treacherous surface. Flashes erupted behind his eyes. Not memories, but impressions of colossal, unnameable forms, vast and shadowy, stirring in unimaginable depths. He clamped his eyes shut, trying to regain his footing, but the visions persisted, pressing against the inside of his eyelids, a silent, terrifying cinema of the impossible. He had been following the song, or rather, it had been pulling him. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an irresistible current dragging a piece of driftwood towards a maelstrom. The sound was strongest here, on the leeward side of the island, where the cliffs crumbled into a jagged, weed-choked coastline. There, half hidden by a tangle of thorny gorse and ancient, salt-blasted rock, he saw it. A rusted, heavily reinforced metal hatch, almost swallowed by the earth. It looked like a scar on the island's face, an old wound left to fester. A cold certainty settled over him, displacing the disorientation with a chilling clarity. This was it. This was where the song originated. This was where his grandfather had gone time and again. He had to see. With a grunt, Dean heaved at the corroded handle. It shrieked in protest, a sound swallowed by the deeper, more pervasive hum. But with a final wrench, the heavy hatch scraped open. It was a smell that pricked at the back of his throat, ancient and stagnant. He retrieved his lantern from his pack, its beam cutting a weak swath through the gloom. He began his descent, the deep song growing in intensity with every step, now a bass thrum that resonated in his chest cavity. The air grew heavier, pressing in on him, making his ears ache. He tasted salt and something bitter on his tongue. The shaft opened into a rough-hewn passage, barely wide enough for his shoulders. The passage snaked downwards, curving in on itself, before widening abruptly into a cavernous space. This was the underground bunker, but it was no ordinary bunker. In the center of the chamber, dominating the space, was the source of the deep song. It was an artifact, or perhaps a living thing, unlike anything Dean had ever conceived. It was immense, easily 20 feet across, rising from the floor like a monstrous petrified heart. Its surface was a glistening, shifting tapestry of deep, bruised purples and greens, veined with what looked like pulsating blue light beneath a semi-translucent membrane. It didn't have distinct edges. Its form seemed to ripple and expand, blurring the line between solid and liquid. The deep song emanated directly from it, a low, guttural vibration that now filled the entire bunker. A sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly within his very being. As Dean stared, mesmerized and horrified, the artifact's internal light intensified, bathing the cavern in an eerie, bioluminescent glow. The surface of the pulsating mass began to churn, and within its depths, images coalesced. He saw the island, but not as he knew it. He saw the familiar lighthouse crumbling, its beacon extinguished, swallowed by a frothing black tide. The cottages along the coast dissolved, not into water, but into the same shifting purple-green mass as the artifact itself. They became extensions of it, their screams silent, their eyes wide and unseeing, staring into an endless, unholy ocean. Then, the vision shifted. It focused on him. He saw himself, standing on the cliff edge, the deep song a roaring tempest in his mind. But his skin was no longer his own. It was translucent, revealing the intricate network of his veins, his organs, all pulsing with the same blue-green light that permeated the artifact. His eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with the same ancient, indifferent vastness. He was not being consumed by the entity. He was becoming it, a vessel, a conduit, his mind stretching beyond human comprehension, dissolving into an oceanic consciousness that was both everything and nothing. This wasn't merely a threat to his life. It was a threat to his very identity, his existence. The island, his sanctuary, was merely a threshold, a stepping stone. And he, Dean, the reclusive cartographer, was being mapped for its ultimate, horrifying purpose. The air in the bunker grew impossibly heavy, crushing, as if the immense pressure of the deep had followed him into this hidden chamber, promising a fate far worse than death. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and sensation. The deep song was no longer just an auditory assault. It was a physical hammer blow against Dean's very being, resonating in the hollows of his bones, rattling the fluid in his inner ear. Each breath was a struggle, the air thick and viscous, tasting of salt and something metallic, something ancient and cold. His legs, heavy as lead, refused to obey. He needed shelter, a place where the pervasive hum couldn't reach him, a solid point in this unraveling reality. A desperate flicker of memory, a note in his grandfather's journal, spoke of an old observation post, a relic from a forgotten war buried mostly underground. The underground bunker. His only chance. He lunged towards it, each step an agony of effort against an invisible current. The entrance, a heavy steel door rusted to the color of dried blood, hung ajar, groaning on its hinges as if protesting his intrusion. He shoved it open further, the sound a grating screech that momentarily cut through the deep song's drone and tumbled inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang, plunging him into absolute blackness. The beam, when it finally flickered to life, cut a weak swath through the damp subterranean air. The bunker was a single claustrophobic chamber, its walls weeping condensation, the air stale and heavy with the scent of mildew and damp earth. Pipes, thick with rust, snaked across the low ceiling, dripping rhythmically into puddles on the concrete floor. "Join us!" He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, but the invasion continued. This wasn't just an external threat. It was trying to burrow in. It was trying to consume him, to make him one of its own. The entity was actively trying to break through, to possess him. But beneath it, a desperate spark of determination flickered. He wouldn't surrender. Not now. Not after everything. His grandfather's journal. It had to hold the answer. He fumbled in his satchel, pulling out the leather-bound book, its pages already brittle with age and seawater. His hands trembled as he flipped through the cryptic entries, the hurried sketches, the frantic warnings. Let go. It is inevitable. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus, to push back against the mental assault. He scanned pages filled with nautical charts marked with strange symbols, constellations that never existed, and finally, near the end, a section marked with a hastily drawn, jagged line. The handwriting, usually meticulous, was erratic here, almost illegible. The language was archaic, veiled in metaphor, but the intent was horrifyingly clear. It wasn't a simple incantation. It was a ritual, and it required a sacrifice. He devoured the text, his eyes darting across the page. The ritual demanded a life, Not just any life, but one connected to the pact, a bloodline offering to sever the connection, to placate the ancient hunger. It spoke of the last scion, the final key. He was the last scion. The journal didn't explicitly name him, but the implications were undeniable. His grandfather, the previous keeper, had understood. He had known this was coming. The terrible sacrifice was him. To stop the entity, to seal the portal, he would have to offer himself. It was a trade, his life for the world's safety. He stared at the faded ink, the crude drawing of a ceremonial dagger, a basin, and a stylized symbol of a swirling vortex. This wasn't just a way to stop it. It was the only way. He could feel his own will faltering, the edges of his consciousness blurring. He was trapped, cornered, and the only escape route led through an unimaginable act of self-annihilation. He clenched the journal tighter, the leather digging into his palm. He wouldn't let it win. If this was the price, then he would pay it. He tried to stay upright, but the ground beneath his feet bucked, a sickening lurch that sent him sprawling. He lay there, tasting the damp earth, his vision swimming in a haze of gray and green, the roar of the ocean a monstrous echo in his skull. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure receded. The guttural hum softened. The rhythmic throb in his chest eased its frantic pace. He pushed himself up, his limbs heavy, as if filled with lead. The air itself felt different now, thick and viscous, pressing down on him. The fog, usually a comforting shroud, had become an opaque, suffocating blanket, blotting out the horizon, swallowing the very light. It clung to his skin like damp, icy fingers and carried a new, unsettling scent. Not just salt and decay, but something sickly sweet, like stagnant pond water mixed with an unknown metallic tang. He stumbled, regaining his balance, his eyes scanning the gloom. The lighthouse, usually a beacon, was barely a blur of gray in the churning mist. The island was no longer simply remote. It felt actively hostile, a living entity writhing under an unseen torment. He heard it then, a low, drawn-out groan that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock, a sound of immense suffering and gathering power. The trees, gnarled and ancient, appeared to writhe in the fog, their branches reaching like skeletal claws, their leaves a darker, more diseased green. He swore he saw the ground itself ripple, a subtle undulation beneath the sparse vegetation, as if something vast and unseen shifted just below the surface. His mind, battered and bruised, clung to a single desperate thought: the journal. His grandfather's cryptic entries were his only compass now. He fumbled for it, his fingers clumsy, pulling the water-stained, leather-bound book from his satchel. He had devoured every line, deciphered every sketch, but a final, critical piece had eluded him. He flipped through the last few pages, his gaze darting across the faded ink, the frantic scrawl of a man driven to the edge. And then he saw it. It was a diagram, intricate and precise, depicting a ritual space, and at its center, a series of concentric circles. Within the innermost circle, a single stark instruction, almost lost in the fraying paper. The heart's blood freely given within the chamber of echoes. Ere the words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The heart's blood, freely given. It wasn't just a counter-ritual. It was a sacrifice. His sacrifice. He understood then the true, terrifying cost. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to contain the entity. He had been preparing for a final, desperate gambit that demanded everything. This was not merely about saving the island, or even the world beyond its shores. It was about saving himself from being swallowed whole, but at an immense personal toll. Fear still gnawed at him, a constant companion, but it was now overshadowed by a grim determination. He wouldn't let the entity consume him, piece by agonizing piece. He would fight back, even if it meant paying the ultimate price. The diagram pointed to a location, a specific set of coordinates he recognized from earlier entries: the underground bunker. He tucked the journal back into his satchel, its weight a heavy burden. The journey across the island was a descent into a waking nightmare. The air vibrated with a low hum, a constant, irritating buzz that seemed to burrow into his inner ear. The fog grew denser, twisting familiar landmarks into grotesque caricatures. He saw things in the periphery of his vision, fleeting shapes that dissolved upon direct gaze, tendrils of mist that seemed to coalesce into skeletal hands, reaching, always reaching. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy in places, like walking on decaying flesh, and the scent of that sickly sweetness intensified, making his stomach clench. They were not words he could understand, but a maddening chorus of clicks, rasps, and wet, gurgling sounds, like something suffocating underwater. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sounds were inside him, resonating in his skull, distorting his sense of reality. He pushed forward, his focus narrowed to a single point: the bunker. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rusted metal door of the underground bunker loomed out of the fog. This was it. The Chamber of Echoes. He was ready. He had to be. The understanding from the previous night, cold and stark, had solidified into a grim resolve. Dean felt it in his bones, a certainty that drowned out the creeping terror. He knew the cost, and he was prepared to pay it. The fog, a clammy shroud, clung to the ancient stones and twisted scrub, muffling the world until only the rhythmic churn of the distant waves and the rasp of his own breath remained. Every step on the rocky path felt heavy, weighted not just by the dampness, but by the unseen gaze that seemed to follow him from the churning gray. The interior was a spiral of cold stone, smelling of salt and decay. He didn't ascend the winding stairs. Instead, he sought the hidden passage his grandfather's journal had described. A stone slab beneath a loose flagstone in the small antechamber, barely visible in the gloom. He took a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs, and began his descent. The smell intensified down here. Not just decay, but something else. Something metallic and acrid, like old blood and ozone. Each rung creaked under his weight, echoing in the confined space. A sound that seemed to stretch and distort, becoming something else entirely. A low, guttural thrum that vibrated in his teeth. Finally, his feet met solid ground. He fumbled for the lantern he carried, its beam a paltry defiance against the gloom. It was a vast, cavernous space, carved crudely from the island's bedrock. The walls wept with perpetual moisture, slick with blackish grime. Strange symbols, etched deep into the rock, covered every surface, their geometries wrong, impossible to hold in his mind's eye. In the center, a crude altar of uncut stone stood, upon which rested a shallow, pitted basin. This was the place. This was where the pact had been made, and where it would be broken. The air in the bunker was thick, a cloying presence that tasted of brine and old fear. It pressed against his eardrums, a silent roar that vibrated deep within his chest. He felt it then, the entity, fully manifested, not as a singular form, but as a distortion of reality itself. It spoke of his sorrow, of the woman he had lost, twisting her memory into a grotesque caricature, her face appearing in the shimmering moisture on the walls, her voice a mocking echo in the cavern. Dean clenched his jaw, his determination a brittle shield against the psychological onslaught. He focused on the altar, on the items he had brought. A small, smooth river stone, a handful of dried sea salt, and a single sharp obsidian shard. His grandfather's journal had been explicit. The stone for grounding, the salt for purification, the shard for the offering. He placed the river stone firmly on the altar, then sprinkled the salt around the basin in a precise circle. The air crackled, the pressure in the bunker intensifying. The temperature plummeted, and he could see his breath, ragged plumes in the frigid air. The entity was fighting back, its presence a hurricane of mental static, attempting to unmake his resolve, to splinter his mind before he could complete the ritual. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, a dizzying nausea as the very fabric of the bunker seemed to waver, the stone walls appearing to breathe, to shift, to close in on him. No, he rasped, his voice raw, barely audible above the silent scream of the entity. He picked up the obsidian shard. Its edge glinted dully in the lantern light, impossibly sharp. He looked at his left palm, scarred from a childhood accident, now trembling. The heart's blood, freely given. It wasn't just blood, he knew. It was the conscious act of offering a piece of himself, a part of his life force, not taken, but given with full awareness of the cost. A sharp, clean pain lanced through him, a stark physical sensation that momentarily cut through the entity's mental assault. A bead of crimson welled up, then another, forming a small pool on his skin. He held his hand over the basin, allowing the warm, vital drops to fall onto the rough stone. The entity shrieked then, a soundless scream that reverberated through his entire being, threatening to tear him apart from the inside out. The very air vibrated, and loose pebbles rained down from the cavern ceiling. He then pressed his bleeding palm against the river stone, smearing it with his offering. As his blood touched the stone, a low, resonant hum began to emanate from the altar, growing in intensity. The symbols carved into the bunker walls began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light, then faded, one by one, as if being erased from existence. The air grew clearer, though still thick with the lingering stench of the entity. Dean stood there, panting, his hand throbbing, his mind reeling from the psychic assault. He had paid the cost. The portal was sealed. The island, he hoped, was free. But the sacrifice had taken more than just blood. It had carved a permanent fissure in his own reality. The cold certainty that had settled in Dean's bones guided him down, deeper than he'd ever ventured before. The entrance to the underground bunker was a jagged maw in the earth, hidden beneath a tangle of salt-crusted brambles and a slab of granite that slid away with a groan of rusted metal. His lantern cast an anemic glow, revealing walls of rough-hewn rock, slick with condensation. Water dripped somewhere in the unseen depths, a monotonous, maddening rhythm. Each step echoed, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence that followed. The deep song. It was not a sound heard with ears, but felt in the marrow, a resonance that promised to unravel the very fabric of his being. He reached the lowest chamber, a circular space, smaller and more claustrophobic than the passages leading to it. In the center, a crude stone altar, pitted and stained, stood like a forgotten tooth. Carved into the surrounding walls were symbols he'd seen before in his grandfather's journals. Intricate, swirling patterns that pulsed faintly in the lantern light, as if breathing. This was the heart of it, the place where the pact had been forged, and where it had to be renewed. Dean set the lantern down, its feeble light illuminating a small, heavy box on the altar. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a single obsidian shard. It hummed, a low frequency that made his teeth ache. This was the anchor, the tether, the price. He picked up the shard. It wasn't just a call. It was a promise of oblivion, a siren's lullaby for the soul. He felt the entity's awareness, vast and indifferent, pressing against the thin membrane of his sanity. It sought entry, sought release, sought to reclaim what was lost. This was the event. The confrontation wasn't with a physical beast, but with a primal force that transcended form. He remembered the island's stark beauty, the gulls crying above the waves, the smell of salt and gorse. He pictured his grandfather, not as a madman, but as a sentinel, burdened by a terrible duty. He pressed the shard firmly into the altar's central depression. A faint, sickening crack echoed through the bunker, not of stone, but of something deeper, something resonant. The symbols on the walls flared, a brief, blinding blue, then faded to a dull, pulsing red. The roar in his mind sharpened, a shriek of thwarted hunger, then slowly, agonizingly began to recede. It was like pulling a hook from his very being, leaving behind a raw, empty space. The entity was not gone, not destroyed. It was merely pushed back, bound. It was a suffocating vacuum, heavier than any noise. Dean opened his eyes. The obsidian shard was now fused with the altar, its surface mirroring the dim lantern light like a single malevolent eye. The pressure behind his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull ache that seemed to reside in his very soul. He understood now. The pact wasn't just a forgotten relic, it was a living obligation. His grandfather hadn't awoken the entity. He had merely kept it dormant, maintained the fragile seal. And now that burden had passed to Dean. This was the reveal. The island wasn't just a place of solitude. It was a prison for something terrible, and he was its new keeper. His sanity was not shattered, not entirely, but it was irrevocably altered. He saw the world differently now, as if a thin, transparent layer of reality had peeled away, revealing the churning, unseen currents beneath. He stood for a long time, listening to the drip of water, the distant, muffled roar of the ocean that now sounded less like waves and more like the breathing of something immense. When he finally ascended, the ascent was heavier than the descent. The air outside felt thin, sharp, almost painful against his skin. The gulls cried overhead, their calls no longer a comfort, but a shrill lament. Dean emerged from the underground bunker and sealed the entrance with a weary heave of the granite slab. He looked at the lighthouse, its beams sweeping across the turbulent waters, a lonely vigil against the encroaching night. It was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol of his new, terrible purpose. He walked back to the cottage, each step heavy with the weight of his inheritance. The wind carried the scent of salt and damp earth, but underneath it, he detected the faint, persistent thrum of the deep song, a part of him now. He was not free. He was bound. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes, but at a cost that transcended all understanding. He was the island's new guardian, a silent sentinel against an ancient horror. The entity waited, and so would he,